They're going to abuse you in prison. You-year-old boy sentenced to death after killing his father. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The courtroom fell silent as 11-year-old David Rayner stood before Judge Martha Collins. His small frame nearly disappeared behind the oversized defendant's table. Outside, the Alabama summer heat pressed against the windows, but inside, the air conditioning chilled everyone to the bone. Or perhaps it was something else causing the shiver that ran through the spectators. In the case of the state of Alabama versus David Rayner, Judge Collins began, her voice steady but heavy. This court finds the defendant guilty of first-degree murder and sentences him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. David didn't flinch. His eyes, hollow and vacant, stared straight ahead, as if he were watching something no one else could see. His court-appointed attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, a meaningless gesture of comfort that came far too late. Among the sea of shocked faces sat Victoria Lang, a reporter for the Wilcox County Chronicle. She'd covered countless trials in her 15-year career, but something about this one made her stomach knot in a way the others never had. Perhaps it was the boy's emptiness, so unlike the panic or despair she typically witnessed. Or perhaps it was the satisfied nod from District Attorney Richard Monroe as the verdict was read. The evidence in this case is overwhelming, the judge continued. The defendant's confession, corroborated by physical evidence found at the scene, leaves no room for doubt. The brutal nature of the crime committed against his father, despite the defendant's young age, requires the maximum sentence under Alabama law. Victoria jotted notes in her worn leather journal, capturing quotes while her mind raced. She'd reviewed the case files. James Rayner, a prominent defense attorney, found bludgeoned in his home office. The murder weapon, a heavy crystal award he'd received for his legal achievements, discovered with his son's fingerprints, the boy's blood-stained pajamas, and most damning of all, David's own confession, delivered in monotone to investigators just hours after the body was discovered. A perfect case. Too perfect, whispered something in the back of Victoria's mind. As bailiffs approached to escort David away, his mother, Ellen Rayner, sobbed quietly in the front row. She hadn't testified during the trial, a strategic decision by the prosecution that Victoria had found curious at the time. Now, watching Ellen's tightly controlled grief, Victoria wondered what stories remained untold. The crowd began to disperse, their hushed conversations forming a current of morbid fascination. A child killer always seemed off to me. Imagine raising a monster like that. Victoria had heard it all. Before, the community's desperate attempt to distance themselves from tragedy, to draw clear lines between normal families and those who produce killers. As she gathered her things, Victoria noticed District Attorney Monroe huddled with Sheriff Carter near the exit. Their conversation appeared intense, with Monroe gesturing sharply before noticing her observation. He straightened immediately, offering a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Just a tragic case all around, isn't it, Ms. Lang?" Monroe said, approaching her. "I hope your article emphasizes the justice that was served. Today, the community needs closure." "I report facts, Mr. Monroe, not narratives," Victoria replied, meeting his gaze. "Of course," he nodded, his smile tightening. "Just remember, some facts serve the public good better than others." As he walked away, Victoria felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. A text message from an unknown number. "The boy didn't do it. Evidence was planted. Meet me tonight if you want the truth." Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen. She glanced up just in time to see David being led through a side door, small wrists shackled, face still, eerily calm, a child headed to spend the rest of his life behind bars. What if they got it all wrong? Victoria Lang sat in her car outside the Wilcox County Courthouse, staring at the text message on her phone. The parking lot had emptied hours ago, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the chirping of cicadas in the nearby trees. She'd been a journalist long enough to recognize the familiar tug of a story that didn't add up. She dialed the unknown number. No answer. "Convenient," she muttered, tossing her phone onto the passenger seat. Once a rising star at the Birmingham Post, Victoria had retreated to this small-town paper 3 years ago, after a source betrayal had demolished her career and reputation. She'd published explosive allegations against a state senator that turned out to be fabricated. The Post had fired her, and most major outlets had blacklisted her name. Now, at 42, she wrote puff pieces and covered local crimes for a fraction of her former salary. Could this be another trap? The drive to her small rented cottage took 15 minutes. Victoria pulled into the gravel driveway, noticing her porch light was on, a light she distinctly remembered. Turning off that morning, she reached into her glove compartment and grabbed her pepper spray before cautiously approaching her front door. It was unlocked. Inside, sitting at her kitchen table with a manila folder, was Ellen Rayner. "I used the spare key under the flower pot," Ellen said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Not very secure for an investigative journalist." Victoria lowered the pepper spray. "Mrs. Rayner, I'm so sorry about—" "Don't," Ellen cut her off. "I didn't come for condolences. I came because you're the only reporter who seemed to question anything during the trial." Victoria approached carefully, noting Ellen's disheveled appearance, so different from the composed woman in court. "The text message, that was you?" Ellen nodded, pushing the folder across the table. "My husband kept meticulous records. It was both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw." Victoria opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. "What am I looking at?" James was preparing to expose corruption in the district attorney's office and the sheriff's department. A year-long investigation into evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and false confessions, particularly in cases involving Monroe. Victoria felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the rush that came with a potentially explosive story, but caution quickly tempered her excitement. Why bring this to me? Why not the FBI or state investigators? Ellen's laugh was bitter. James tried. 3 weeks before his murder, he submitted evidence to the state attorney general's office. The day after, our home was broken into. Nothing was taken, but James knew it was a warning. Victoria leafed through the documents, her journalistic instinct telling her this was either the biggest story of her career or the final nail in its coffin. "And you believe your son is innocent? Despite his confession?" Ellen's eyes filled with tears. "David has never been violent. Not once in his life. He worshipped his father. And that confession," her voice broke. "Something's wrong with it. David uses words in it that I've never heard him say. Phrases that sound like they came from an adult." Victoria remembered the boy's empty expression in court. Why would he confess to something he didn't do? "That's what you need to find out," Ellen said, standing to leave. "David won't speak to me now. He won't speak to anyone. It's like he's been programmed." At the door, Ellen paused. "Monroe and Sheriff Carter will destroy these records if they find them. They already searched my house twice under the guise of gathering evidence. They're looking for what James had on them." Victoria held up the folder. "If what you're saying is true, coming to me was dangerous." "They're already watching me," Ellen said simply. "But they won't expect me to trust the journalist whose career was ruined by a false source. Your disgrace is your perfect cover." After Ellen left, Victoria spread the documents across her kitchen table. Her journalistic instinct, the one she'd learned to distrust after her spectacular fall, was screaming that something was very wrong in Wilcox County. Her phone rang again, the unknown number from before. "Hello?" she answered. A man's voice, disguised, electronically responded, "If you're looking into the Rayner case, check the autopsy report. Page 4. The time of death doesn't match when they claim the boy did it. He had an alibi they buried." The line went dead. Who else knew she was investigating? And more importantly, who else wanted the truth to come out? Victoria spent the night poring over James Rayner's documents. By morning, her kitchen table had transformed into an investigative war room, with papers organized into careful piles and a timeline sketched on her whiteboard. The anonymous caller's tip about the autopsy report had proven accurate. There was a discrepancy of nearly 2 hours between the official time of death and when David allegedly committed the murder. Coffee in hand, Victoria drove to Wilcox County Library to research the Rayner family's history. The librarian, Mrs. Faulkner, a gray-haired fixture in the community, recognized her immediately. "Working on your article about the trial?" she asked, eyes bright with curiosity. "Background research," Victoria replied vaguely. "I want to understand who the Rayners were before the tragedy." Mrs. Faulkner's expression softened. "Such a shame. They seemed like the perfect family." She pulled out a folder. "Here are all the newspaper mentions of the Rayners over the years. I started collecting them after, well, you know." Victoria thanked her and settled at a corner table. The clippings painted a picture of local royalty. James Rayner winning. High-profile cases, giving speeches at charity events, coaching Little League. Ellen appearing alongside him at social functions, always impeccably dressed, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. And David, their only child, receiving academic awards and participating in science fairs. A model American family, at least on paper. Victoria made copies of the articles and headed to her next stop, Oak Ridge Elementary School, where David had been a fifth grader until his arrest 6 months ago. The principal, Dr. Walsh, was reluctant to speak with her, but eventually agreed to a brief meeting. "I can't discuss confidential student information," he warned as Victoria sat across from his desk. "I understand," Victoria nodded. "I'm just trying to get a sense of David as a student. Was he ever violent? Did he have disciplinary issues?" Dr. Walsh's brow furrowed. "Quite the opposite. David was exceptionally quiet, almost painfully shy. His teachers described him as invisible in class, never volunteering answers, though his written work showed remarkable intelligence. Friends? None that we observed. He spent recesses alone, usually reading." The principal hesitated. "There was something off about his social development, but not in an alarming way. We actually had a meeting scheduled with his parents about possible testing for high-functioning autism, but then the murder happened," Victoria finished. Dr. Walsh nodded uncomfortably. "What struck us afterward was how none of us could reconcile the David we knew with what he allegedly did. It was like hearing a different child had committed the crime." Outside the school, Victoria noticed a playground where children were enjoying recess. She spotted a teacher watching her and approached. "Excuse me, did you know you, David Rayner?" The woman, mid-30s with kind eyes, tensed. "I'm not supposed to talk about that." "Please," Victoria pressed. "I'm trying to understand what happened." After a moment's hesitation, the teacher spoke quietly. "I was his fourth-grade teacher, Ms. Brennan. David was brilliant but troubled. He'd come to school exhausted some days, like he hadn't slept. Once I noticed bruises on his wrists. When I asked, he said they were from practice." "Practice for what?" "He wouldn't say. I reported it to administration, but nothing came of it. James Rayner was respected in this town. Questions about his parenting weren't welcome." Victoria felt a chill. "Did you believe David could be violent?" Ms. Brennan shook her head firmly. "Never. But I did believe he was afraid of something, or someone." Victoria's next stop was the Rayner neighborhood. The imposing colonial home stood empty now, crime scene tape still visible on the front door despite the months that had passed. An elderly man was watering plants next door. Victoria introduced herself, and after some small talk asked about the family. "Name's Harold Winters," he said. "Been neighbors with the Rayners for 12 years. What were they like as neighbors?" Harold glanced at the Rayner house. "Kept to themselves mostly. James was hardly home, always working late. Ellen seemed fragile, jumpy. As for the boy, quiet as a mouse. Did you ever hear anything unusual from their house?" "Arguments?" Harold's watering slowed. "Well, now that you mention it, there were nights I'd hear shouting. Man's voice. James, I presume. Then something breaking. I called the police once about 3 years back. Officer came, spoke to James, left within minutes. Next day, James brought over an expensive bottle of Scotch. Said they'd been watching a football game too loudly." He paused. "Never did see any sports equipment in that house, though." As Victoria thanked him and turned to leave, Harold called after her. "There's something else. The night of the murder, I was up late with my insomnia. Around 2 a.m., I Saw a car I didn't recognize parked down the street. Dark sedan, engine running. It pulled away right after I noticed it. Did you tell the police? Course I did. They said it was probably just someone visiting a neighbor. But at 2 a.m. in this neighborhood? Harold shook his head. Nobody took it. Seriously, because they already had their killer, didn't they? That poor boy. Driving away, Victoria couldn't shake the unsettling picture emerging of the perfect Rayner family. A controlling, possibly abusive father, an isolated, fearful mother, and a withdrawn child who somehow confessed to a brutal crime that seemed entirely out of character. She reached for her phone to call Ellen Rayner, but it rang before she could dial. Victoria Lang, she answered. Ms. Lang, came a cold, familiar voice. Sheriff Carter here. I'd like you to come down to the station immediately. We need to discuss your interference in an active investigation. The Wilcox County Sheriff's Department occupied a squat brick building across from the courthouse. Victoria parked her aging sedan between two gleaming police cruisers, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked tired. Good. Better to appear harmless. The reception area smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Deputy Simmons, a young officer with a military haircut, escorted her to Sheriff Carter's office without a word. Ms. Lang, Sheriff Carter greeted her with artificial warmth. He was a large man whose uniform strained against his broad shoulders. His desk was obsessively tidy, with a photo of him shaking hands with the governor prominently displayed. Have a seat. Victoria sat, maintaining a relaxed posture despite her racing heart. You said something about interference in an investigation. The Rayner case is closed, isn't it? The boy was convicted. And that conviction is final, Carter said, his smile never reaching his eyes. Yet you've been asking questions all over town. The school, the neighbors, even pulling old records. Victoria kept her expression neutral. I'm writing a follow-up piece for the Chronicle. Human interest. How a tragedy affects a small community. That right? Because Mrs. Faulkner at the library says you were researching the family's history. Principal Walsh says you asked specifically about the boy's behavior. And Harold Winters says you were asking about the night of the murder. The sheriff leaned forward. Sounds less like human interest and more like you're trying to reopen a case that's been decided by a jury. I'm thorough in my reporting. Carter's facade cracked slightly. Let me be clear, Ms. Lang. This town has been through enough. Trauma. We don't need some washed-up reporter stirring up doubts for the sake of a headline. Victoria bristled at the insult but kept her voice level. Is there a law against interviewing people for an article? No law, but there are consequences for irresponsible journalism. Your career already took one hit, didn't it? After that fabricated political scandal in Birmingham. He picked up a folder. Quite the fall from grace. The Chronicle was the only paper that would touch you. Would be ashamed to lose that too. Ice filled Victoria's veins. He had done his homework. Are you threatening me, Sheriff? Just making an observation. He closed the folder. James Rayner was my friend. I want his memory and his family to have peace. The door opened, and District Attorney Richard Monroe entered without knocking. He wore an expensive suit that screamed ambition, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. His surprise at seeing Victoria seemed rehearsed. Ms. Lang, I didn't know you were here. He turned to Carter. Is everything all right? Just having a friendly conversation about journalistic ethics, Carter replied. Monroe pulled up a chair. The Rayner case was straightforward, Ms. Lang. The evidence was overwhelming. David's fingerprints on the murder weapon, blood spatter on his clothes consistent with the crime, and most damning, his own confession. Children have falsely confessed before, Victoria countered, especially under pressure. Monroe's jaw tightened. There was no pressure. David confessed voluntarily with his mother present. Did she have legal representation there? She waived it. She was in shock, understandably. But she never disputed that David was speaking freely. Victoria made a mental note to ask Ellen about this. It contradicted what she'd told her. And what about the time of death discrepancy? Victoria asked, watching their reactions carefully. The autopsy report placed death between midnight and 2 a.m., but the confession states the murder happened at 10 p.m. A flash of something, alarm. crossed Monroe's face before he recovered. Medical examiners give time ranges, not exact times. The earlier end of that range is consistent with David's statement. And the DNA under James Rayner's fingernails that didn't match David's? This time, Sheriff Carter visibly stiffened. Where did you get that information? Victoria kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. She was fishing based on a hunch from reviewing the documents, and apparently hit something. I'm just asking if it was investigated. Monroe stood abruptly. Ms. Lang, let me be direct. The Rayner case was the most thoroughly investigated homicide in this county's history. Every piece of evidence pointed to David. If you publish anything suggesting a miscarriage of justice without concrete proof, I'll sue you and the Chronicle for defamation. Sheriff Carter and I have reputations to protect. And careers to advance, Victoria added pointedly. I hear you're running for State Attorney General next year, Mr. Monroe. Monroe's smile was glacial. This conversation is over. Sheriff, please show Ms. Lang out. In the parking lot, Victoria sat in her car, hands shaking slightly. Their reaction to her bluff about DNA evidence told her more than any interview could have. There was something they were hiding, something worth threatening her over. As she started her engine, her phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. Check the boy's medical records from Wilson Memorial Hospital. 3 visits in the year before the murder. Look at the attending physician's notes. Victoria's heart raced. Another anonymous tip. She glanced around the parking lot, wondering if someone was watching her. The only person visible was Deputy Simmons, photographing her license plate with his phone. They were watching her every move, but they weren't the only ones watching. Who was helping her? And more importantly, what would they risk to expose the truth? Victoria drove directly to Ellen Rayner's apartment on the outskirts of town. The complex was run down, a stark contrast to the colonial home the family once shared. She knocked repeatedly, but no one answered. She left yesterday, said an elderly neighbor, peering through her doorway. Packed a small bag, said she needed some space from the gossip. Victoria frowned. Ellen hadn't mentioned any travel plans. With her primary source gone, Victoria needed those medical records more than ever. But accessing them legally would require Ellen's authorization. Her phone rang. Her editor at the Chronicle. Vic, Frank Barnes said, his voice tense. Why did I just get a call from the DA saying you're harassing witnesses in a closed case? Victoria explained her suspicions while driving away from Ellen's apartment. Jesus, Vic, Frank sighed. I gave you this job when nobody else would touch you. Don't make me regret it. Frank, there's something wrong here. A child is serving life for a crime he might not have committed. That child confessed. Look, I understand wanting redemption after Birmingham, but this isn't about me, Victoria interrupted, though the accusation stung. It's about justice. A long pause. You've got 2 weeks. After that, you're back on city council meetings and high school football. And Vic, don't break any laws. Victoria hung up and drove to the Rayner house. Crime scene tape still crossed the front door, but she wasn't interested in the main entrance. Based on the floor plans in James's files, there was a cellar door on the side of the house. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, Victoria slipped to the backyard. The cellar entrance was padlocked, but a window nearby had been broken, probably by neighborhood kids. She squeezed through, dropping into a musty storage room. Upstairs, the house was frozen in time. Family photos still hung on walls. Dishes sat in the drying rack. But Victoria wasn't here for the obvious. She was looking for what James had called his insurance policy in his notes, evidence he'd apparently hidden in the house. She found David's room first. Walls painted blue, shelves lined with books and model planes. Everything was meticulously organized, not typical for an 11-year-old boy. On his desk sat a journal, which Victoria pocketed quickly. Down the hall, she discovered what must have been the room of punishment Ellen had mentioned. It was small, windowless, more like a large closet. The walls were bare except for scratch marks near the floor. Victoria's stomach turned as she realized they were at the height where a child would sit. In the master bedroom, Victoria checked the places James had noted in his files, behind the air vent, under loose floorboards. Nothing. Either James had moved his evidence or someone had found it first. As she prepared to leave, Victoria noticed a section of wallpaper that seemed slightly discolored in the hall closet. Pulling it back revealed a small safe embedded in the wall. She tried the combination from James's notes, his son's birthday. Inside was a single USB drive and a key labeled Storage Unit. 23 Wilcox Secure Storage. Headlights swept across the front of the house as a car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, Victoria recognized Sheriff Carter's cruiser. She slipped the items into her pocket and headed for the cellar window. As she climbed out, she heard the front door opening, and Carter's voice calling out. The drive to the storage facility would have to wait. First, she needed to see what was on the USB drive, and what secrets David had written in his journal. Victoria's hands trembled as she inserted the USB drive into her laptop. The files were encrypted. Without the password, they were useless. She turned to David's journal instead, a simple composition notebook with his name neatly printed on the cover. Inside, the handwriting was precise, almost painfully so for a child his age. Most entries were mundane, school assignments, books he'd read, but scattered. Throughout were disturbing entries. Dad had the bad mood again. Had to go to the quiet room, 3 hours this time. Mom cried at dinner. Dad said she was embarrassing him. Later they fought about the medicine again. Dad says I need to be stronger. No one respects weakness. I failed the test today. Victoria wondered what test a defense attorney would give his son. The last entry, dated the day before the murder, read, Dad says tomorrow is an important lesson. Says I'll finally understand how the world really works. A knock at her front door startled her. Through the window, she saw District Attorney Monroe's sleek black sedan in her driveway. She quickly hid the journal and USB drive under a loose floorboard she'd discovered when moving in. Monroe stood on her porch, his expensive suit replaced by casual attire that somehow still looked tailored. He held a bottle of wine. Ms. Lang, he smiled. I thought we should clear the air after this afternoon. May I come in? Victoria hesitated, then stepped aside. Keep your enemies closer. Nice place, Monroe commented, though his expression suggested otherwise. Small, but charming. What do you want, Mr. Monroe? He placed, the wine on her kitchen counter. To understand why you're pursuing this, the case is closed. David Rayner confessed. Justice was served. Was it? Victoria challenged. Because from what I've gathered, a vulnerable child was railroaded through a system designed to protect him. Monroe's smile hardened. You sound like James, always believing he was the only ethical lawyer in the room. He glanced around her kitchen. You know, we found James's files after his death. Lots of conspiracy theories, but nothing substantial. Victoria kept her expression neutral, despite her racing heart. They'd searched for James's evidence and hadn't found it all. I'm just doing my job, she said, following the story where it leads. And if it leads nowhere? What then? Monroe moved closer. You've already destroyed one career on false allegations. Do you really want to repeat that mistake? That was different. My source lied to me. And how do you know Ellen Rayner isn't lying? A grieving widow, possibly unstable, looking for someone to blame besides her son. He sighed. Victoria, this town respects tradition, hierarchy, the people who maintain order. James forgot that. Don't make the same mistake. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. I'm running for state attorney general next year. Sheriff Carter's eyeing my job. Judge Collins is headed for the federal bench. We've all worked too hard to let a tabloid story derail our futures. And what about David's future? Victoria challenged. Locked up for life at 11 years old? Monroe's facade cracked slightly. Some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. One troubled child versus the good we can do in higher offices? The math is simple. Victoria felt sick. So you admit he might be innocent? Monroe laughed, but his eyes remained cold. I admit nothing. I'm simply explaining political reality. He moved toward the door. Think about your own future, Victoria. The Chronicle is a dead-end job. I have connections at major networks. Help us put this story to bed properly and I could make a call. After he left, Victoria stood frozen, processing his implicit admission and blatant bribe. Her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number, her mysterious source again. Monroe visited storage unit last week. Change the lock. Whatever was there might be gone, but check Wilson Memorial Hospital. Tomorrow. Dr. Patel works 7 to 3. She treated the boy. She'll talk. Victoria's pulse quickened. How did her source know about Monroe's visit? And about the storage key she just found? Someone was watching her investigation unfold in real time. Someone with inside information. Her phone rang again. Was Ellen Rayner. Victoria, she whispered, her voice shaking. They know I gave you James's files. They're watching my sister's house where I'm staying. I think they bugged my phone. I can't talk long. Ellen, where are you exactly? I'll come. No, just listen. There's something about David's confession they're hiding. He didn't. The line went dead. Victoria immediately tried calling back. No answer. She texted, Ellen, are you safe? 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then a single text came through. Forget about the case. David is guilty. I was wrong to contact you. Victoria stared at the message, certain it wasn't actually from Ellen. Someone had her phone, or was forcing her to send this, which meant Ellen Rayner was in danger, and Victoria might be next. Victoria barely slept that night, her mind racing through possibilities. By dawn, she'd made a decision. If Ellen was in danger, the best protection was exposing the truth quickly. Wilson Memorial Hospital was a 30-minute drive from Wilcox County. Victoria arrived at 7:15 a.m., asking for Dr. Patel at the reception desk. She's with a patient, the receptionist said. Do you have an appointment? It's about David Rayner, Victoria replied quietly. The receptionist's expression changed. Wait in the cafeteria. I'll tell her you're here. 20 minutes later, a woman in a white coat approached. Dr. Patel was younger than Victoria expected, with intelligent eyes and a cautious demeanor. You're asking about the Rayner boy, she said, sitting across from Victoria. Why? I believe he might be innocent. His mother thinks so too. Dr. Patel glanced around the nearly empty cafeteria. I can lose my license for discussing patient information. You could also help free an innocent child. The doctor sighed. I treated David 3 times in the year before the murder. Officially for accidents. A broken wrist from falling off his bike, bruised ribs from sports practice, mild concussion from falling downstairs. Victoria's stomach tightened. And unofficially, the injuries were consistent with abuse. The pattern, the defensive nature of the wounds. I filed reports with Child Protective Services each time. What happened to those reports? Dr. Patel's expression hardened. Nothing. They were investigated and dismissed. James Rayner was respected, connected, and Ellen was compliant. She'd confirm whatever story James told. Victoria took notes. Was David violent or aggressive during his visits? Quite the opposite. He was withdrawn, almost catatonic at times. He spoke only when directly addressed, and then in this flat, rehearsed way. I noted potential signs. Psychological conditioning in my reports. Conditioning? Like brainwashing? Dr. Patel hesitated. More like systematic emotional manipulation, breaking down someone's will and rebuilding it to serve your purposes. It's rare to see in parent-child relationships, but not unheard of in certain personality disorders. Victoria recalled David's journal entries about tests and lessons. Could that conditioning include making him confess to something he didn't do? Absolutely, especially for a child desperate for approval from an abusive parent, or afraid of consequences for disobedience. Victoria leaned forward. Dr. Patel, would you be willing to go on record with this? I already did during the investigation. I submitted a full psychological evaluation suggesting David's confession should be questioned given his history. It was never entered into evidence. Who blocked it? The DA's office claimed it was speculative, but my report disappeared entirely from the case file. When I asked about it, Judge Collins said she'd never received it. As Victoria digested this, Dr. Patel slid a flash drive across the table. This is a copy of my evaluation plus all of David's medical records. I kept duplicates after the originals vanished. I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Victoria pocketed the drive. Thank you. This is incredibly— Don't thank me, Dr. Patel interrupted, standing to leave. I failed that boy once already by not pushing harder. Just make it right. Back in her car, Victoria plugged the flash drive into her laptop. The files confirmed everything Dr. Patel had said, plus something even more significant. David's confession contained language and concepts that a comprehensive cognitive evaluation had determined were beyond his developmental capability. Phrases like, "I experienced uncontrollable rage," and "I was cognizant of my actions but unable to restrain myself," didn't match the vocabulary or psychological understanding of an 11-year-old, even a bright one like David. Someone had written that confession for him, and somehow they'd convinced him to recite it. Victoria started her car, mind racing. She needed to hear the original confession recording, to compare it to David's actual speech patterns from before the murder. As she pulled out of the hospital parking lot, a black SUV with tinted windows fell into place behind her. It followed her for 10 miles, always maintaining the same distance, before suddenly turning off. But by then, a police cruiser had appeared in her rearview mirror. The lights flashed on, signaling her to pull over. Deputy Simmons approached her window, his expression grim. "Ms. Lang, I need you to step out of the vehicle. Sheriff Carter wants to speak with you at the station." "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," he said ominously. "But interfering with a minor's sealed medical records might change that." How did they know where she'd been? Who was watching her? And what would they do to keep her from exposing the truth? "I didn't access any sealed records," Victoria said firmly, remaining in her car. "I interviewed a doctor about her professional observations." "That's not illegal." Deputy Simmons shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm just following orders. Do you have a warrant, or are you arresting me?" When he hesitated, Victoria made a quick decision. "Tell Sheriff Carter I'll come to the station at 2 p.m. I need to file my story for the Chronicle first." Before he could respond, she rolled up her window and drove away. In her rearview mirror, she saw Simmons speaking urgently into his radio, but he didn't follow. Victoria drove straight to the Chronicle offices where her editor, Frank Barnes, was waiting, his expression grave. "Sheriff Carter called," he said. "Claims you're interfering with an investigation and accessing sealed medical records." Victoria placed Dr. Patel's flash drive on his desk. "I have evidence suggesting David Rayner's confession was fabricated, possibly by the DA's office." Frank's eyes widened. "That's a serious accusation. I need to interview people connected to James Rayner, former clients, colleagues. Someone else might have wanted him dead." Frank hesitated. "Vic, the sheriff is threatening to subpoena our files." Monroe called the paper's owner. "Then I need to work fast." Victoria pulled out a list of names from James's files. These were his associates. "I need contact information for as many as possible." After reluctant agreement from Frank, Victoria spent the morning making calls. Most went unanswered or ended with abrupt hang-ups when she mentioned James Rayner, but 3 people agreed to meet: Martin Webb, James's former law partner, Sarah Donovan, a court clerk, and Melissa Holt, who had been the Rayners' babysitter. Martin Webb met her at a diner outside town. In his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive watch, he seemed nervous. "I left the practice 3 years ago," he explained, voice low. James was changing, becoming obsessed with corruption claims. Were they legitimate claims? Webb stirred his coffee. James believed Monroe and Carter were orchestrating false confessions to improve conviction rates. Using intimidation, evidence tampering, he was gathering proof. Did he find any? "I don't know. I told him to drop it. It was dangerous. Monroe has powerful connections in state politics." Victoria leaned forward. "Did James have enemies? Someone who might have wanted him dead? Besides the entire sheriff's department and DA's office?" Webb laughed bitterly. "James was aggressive in court, made enemies easily. But murder?" He shook his head. "Only if he threatened someone's future." Next, Victoria met Sarah Donovan in a park. The court clerk was a mousy woman who kept looking over her shoulder. "Records went missing," she whispered. "Evidence logged but never presented at trial." including Dr. Patel's. Evaluation. Who had access? Judge Collins's clerk, the DA's office, sheriff's evidence technicians. A conspiracy that large seems impossible to coordinate, Victoria noted. Sarah's eyes darted around nervously. Unless they all had something to gain. Monroe wants to be Attorney General. Carter wants Monroe's job. Collins wants a federal appointment. And James threatened all that? He filed a complaint with the State Judiciary Committee 3 weeks before his death. I helped him prepare it. Sarah stood to leave. That's all I can say. I have kids to support. Melissa Holt, the former babysitter, met Victoria at the library. A college student now, she had watched David occasionally when he was younger. David was the easiest kid I ever babysat, she recalled. Too easy. He'd sit perfectly still for hours, never asked for anything. Did you notice anything unusual about the family? Melissa hesitated. Mr. Rayner had strict rules. Once David spilled juice on the carpet. When I mentioned it to Mr. Rayner, he said, "He'll be punished appropriately." The way he said it made my skin crawl. Did you ever see the quiet room? Melissa's eyes widened. How did you know? About that? It was this closet Mr. Rayner converted. If David broke rules, he went in there. Mrs. Rayner told me never to open it, even if I heard crying. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her anonymous source. Check James's old client Trevor Phillips, released from prison 3 months before. The murder. Blamed James for extra 2 years on his sentence. As Victoria stood to leave, Melissa grabbed her arm. There's something else. The night before the murder, I was supposed to babysit. Mrs. Rayner canceled at the last minute, said they were having a family lesson. She sounded afraid. Victoria's mind raced as she pieced together the disparate information. The picture emerging was disturbing. A prominent lawyer uncovering corruption, an abused child, missing evidence, ambitious officials, and now a possible alternate suspect in an ex-con with a grudge. She checked her watch. It was 0:45 p.m. She was supposed to meet Sheriff Carter in 15 minutes. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Ms. Lang. The voice was disguised electronically, like her anonymous source. Don't go to the sheriff's station. They have a warrant for your arrest on fabricated charges. Monroe is moving. To suppress your investigation. Who is this? How do you know all this? Someone who wants justice for David. Check the boy's confession video. Focus on his eyes. He was drugged. The line went dead. Victoria rushed back to the Chronicle offices, her mind racing. If the warning was legitimate, she had little time before they arrested her on whatever charges they'd manufactured. Frank, she called, bursting into his office. I need to see David Rayner's confession video now. Her editor looked up, startled. How would I get that? It's sealed evidence. The Chronicle covered the trial. You must have copies of the exhibits the prosecution released to the press. Frank hesitated, then nodded slowly. Archives, basement level. Box labeled Rayner trial. But Vic, Sheriff Carter called again. He sounds serious. What have you gotten yourself into? The truth, she replied simply, already. Heading for the stairs. In the dusty basement archive, Victoria found the box in a small viewing room with an outdated DVD player. The confession video was exactly where it should be, labeled State's Exhibit A. The recording began with standard police identification, date, time, location. Then, the camera focused on David, small and frail in an oversized chair. Ellen sat beside him, her face blank with shock. Sheriff Carter and D.A. Monroe stood in the background. David's confession was eerily calm, detached. I experienced uncontrollable rage when my father told me I was disappointing him. Again, the boy recited, his eyes unfocused and dilated. I took the award from his desk and struck him repeatedly. I was cognizant of my actions but unable to restrain myself. Victoria leaned closer to the screen, studying his eyes. The anonymous caller was right. David's pupils were unnaturally dilated, his gaze unfocused. The boy seemed almost in a trance. More disturbing was how adult his phrasing sounded, using vocabulary no 11-year-old would naturally employ. Even the cadence was wrong, as if he were reciting memorized lines. Victoria fast-forwarded through the rest of the confession. pausing when Monroe stepped forward to question David. "Did anyone help you plan this, David?" Monroe asked. "No, it was just me," the boy responded mechanically. "And your mother, was she involved?" A barely perceptible hesitation. "No." Victoria rewound and watched that moment again. David's eyes had flicked towards someone off camera before answering. Following the direction of his gaze, she realized he'd looked at Sheriff Carter. She ejected the DVD and headed back upstairs, nearly colliding with a young reporter in the hallway. "Victoria, thank God," said Jenny Parker, the Chronicle's junior crime reporter. "Sheriff's deputies are out front. They're asking for you." Victoria peered through the blinds. 2 patrol cars were parked in front of the building. "Is there another way out?" Jenny nodded. "Loading dock and back." "My car's there, take it." She handed over her keys. "What's going on?" "Corruption at the highest levels of county government," Victoria replied, heading for the back stairs. "If I don't call you in 24 hours, publish everything in this folder." She handed Jenny a manila envelope containing copies of all her evidence so far. 10 minutes later, Victoria was driving Jenny's compact car toward the county line, mind churning. She needed to find Ellen Rayner, the only witness to David's confession who might tell the truth. Her phone rang. "Frank." "Victoria, they have a warrant. Tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice." "What the hell is happening?" "They're framing me, just like they framed David." "Where would Ellen Rayner go if she were hiding, Frank? You've lived here your whole life." Frank was silent for a moment. "Her sister had a lake cabin about 30 miles north. Might start there." As Victoria turned onto the highway, she noticed headlights in her rearview mirror. The same black SUV from earlier. Someone was following her again. She took a sudden exit, winding through back roads to shake her tail. When she was confident she'd lost them, she pulled over and tried the number Ellen had called from last night. Still no answer. Desperate, she dialed her anonymous source's number. "I need to find Ellen Rayner," she said when they answered. "Her sister's lake cabin. Do you know where it is?" "Lakeview Drive, cabin 17, the disguised voice replied immediately. "But Victoria, be careful. Ellen isn't alone." "Who's with her?" "Judge Collins. They're old friends, college roommates. Ellen reached out for help." Victoria felt a chill. "Judge Collins? The same judge who presided over David's case?" "Yes. And she's the one who buried Dr. Patel's evaluation. She's part of it all." Victoria's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The conspiracy was even larger than she'd imagined, reaching all the way to the judge who had sentenced an 11-year-old boy to life in prison. "There's something else you should know," the voice continued. "The prosecutor, judge, and sheriff weren't the only ones with something to gain from James's death." "What do you mean?" "Check James's life insurance policy. $10 million. And guess who the sole beneficiary was after his death?" Victoria's breath caught as the pieces suddenly shifted in her mind, forming an entirely new picture. Ellen Rayner. Night had fallen by the time Victoria reached Lakeview Drive. A row of modest cabins lined the shore, most dark and vacant this time of year. Number 17 sat at the end of the road, a single light glowing from its window. Victoria parked Jenny's car a quarter-mile away and approached on foot. As she neared the cabin, she heard voices through the partially open window. "They know I talked to her," Ellen's voice trembling. "What if she finds out everything?" "She won't," another woman, presumably Judge Collins, replied firmly. "The sheriff will arrest her tonight. Monroe has arranged for the Chronicle to retract whatever she publishes." Victoria crouched beneath the window, phone in hand, recording. "And David?" Ellen asked. "David is safe where he is," Judge Collins said. "Better a juvenile facility than what James had planned for him." Victoria's mind raced. What had James planned? "I never thought it would go this far," Ellen whispered. "The boy losing his entire future." "We all made sacrifices," Collins replied coldly. "I risked my judicial career. Carter and Monroe put their advancement on the line. You got your freedom and financial security. And David got a life sentence," Ellen said, her voice breaking. "A necessary sacrifice. James was going to expose all of us, everything we'd built." Victoria had heard enough. She needed to confront Ellen directly. She circled to the front door and knocked firmly. Silence fell inside, then footsteps. Judge Collins opened the door, her stern, Courtroom demeanor replaced by visible shock. "Ms. Lang, how did you—" Victoria pushed past her into the cabin. "Ellen, we need to talk." Ellen Rayner sat at a small table, her face pale. "Victoria, you shouldn't be here. There's a warrant for my arrest, I know." Victoria placed her phone on the table, still recording. "You set me up. All of you did." Judge Collins recovered her composure. "That's a serious accusation." "Not as serious as framing an 11-year-old boy for murder," Victoria countered, "or conspiring to obstruct justice, or falsifying evidence." "You have no proof," Collins said dismissively. "I have David's medical records showing years of abuse. I have witness statements about evidence that disappeared. I have Dr. Patel's suppressed evaluation. And now," she gestured to her phone, "I have your conversation admitting to conspiracy." Ellen's face crumpled. "You don't understand. James was a monster." "So you killed him?" Victoria asked directly. "No." Ellen looked genuinely shocked. "I would never—" "But you know who did," Victoria pressed. "And you let David take the blame." Tears streamed down Ellen's face. "You don't know what James was capable of, what he did to us, the control, the manipulation." "Ellen, stop," Judge Collins warned. "I know about the life insurance policy," Victoria continued. $10 million. Quite a motive." Ellen shook her head violently. "I didn't want the money. I just wanted to escape with David. But James would never let us go." "So who killed him?" "That's enough," Judge Collins interrupted, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling Sheriff Carter." "Go ahead," Victoria said. "I've already sent copies of everything I have to journalists at 3 state newspapers. If I'm arrested, they publish everything." It was a bluff, but it worked. Collins hesitated. "Tell me what really happened," Victoria demanded, turning back to Ellen. Ellen seemed to collapse inward. "James found out I was planning to leave him, take David and disappear. He was going to teach us both a final lesson that night." She shuddered. I was terrified. "So you killed him in self-defense." "I told you I didn't kill him," Ellen cried. "I wasn't even home when it happened. James sent me to pick up dinner. When I returned—" She trailed off, her eyes haunted. "The murder scene was already set up," Victoria finished. "And David was there." Ellen nodded miserably. "Sheriff Carter was already there too. He told me James had been investigating them. Monroe, Collins himself, said they had evidence that could destroy them all. So they offered you a deal," Victoria guessed. "David takes the blame, you get the insurance money, and their corruption stays hidden. They said it was the only way to protect David," Ellen whispered. "That James had made powerful enemies who would come after him too. That a juvenile facility was the safest place for him." "And you believed them?" Ellen's expression hardened suddenly. "I didn't have a choice. They had already coached David on his confession. He was drugged, confused. They threatened to charge me as an accomplice if I didn't cooperate." Victoria stared at the broken woman before her. "So if you didn't kill James, and David didn't, then who did?" A floorboard creaked behind them. "I think," said a familiar voice. "That's the question everyone's been trying very hard not to answer." Victoria turned to find District Attorney Richard Monroe standing in the doorway, a gun in his hand. Monroe closed the cabin door behind him, keeping the gun trained on Victoria. "You've been quite persistent, Ms. Lang. Admirable in a journalist. Dangerous in this situation." Victoria's mind raced, calculating options. Her phone was still recording on the table. "Richard, what are you doing?" Judge Collins demanded, her judicial authority useless against the weapon. "Cleaning up your mess, Margaret," he replied coldly. "As usual." Victoria studied Monroe carefully. "You killed James Rayner." "An oversimplification," Monroe said, his politician's smile never reaching his eyes. "James was going to destroy everything we'd built in this county. Our justice system, our careers, the order we maintained." "Your corruption, you mean," Victoria countered. Monroe shrugged. "Call it what you want. In places like Wilcox County, justice is what we say it is. James forgot that rule." Ellen whimpered softly. "You promised David would be safe. And he is. Juvenile detention is quite humane these days." Monroe gestured toward the couch with his gun. Please, everyone sit down. We need to discuss how this ends. Victoria remained standing. The recording I just made will end it for you. Your phone, Monroe smiled. Easily disposed of. And I'm afraid your credibility isn't what it once was, Ms. Lang. Not after Birmingham. I sent everything to other journalists. Victoria bluffed again. No, you didn't, Monroe said confidently. We've been monitoring your communications. You've been too busy playing detective to actually file your story. Victoria felt a chill. He was right. Richard, this has gone too far, Judge Collins said, her voice shaking. We agreed no one would get hurt. Except David, Victoria interjected. And James. James hurt himself, Monroe snapped. He was going to file evidence of our procedural shortcuts with the state attorney general. Cases where we'd helped justice along. Planted evidence. Pressured confessions, all to keep criminals off our streets. To advance your careers, Victoria corrected. Monroe's smile tightened. A beneficial side effect. Now here's what happens next. Ms. Lang, you're going to write a full traction. Admit you fabricated evidence in a desperate attempt to resurrect your career. Ellen will confirm you pressured her into making false statements. And if I refuse? Then tragically, Ellen's grief drove her to violence. She attacked you and Judge Collins when confronted with her lies. I was forced to intervene. The threat hung in the air. Victoria noticed Judge Collins had gone very still. You never intended for any of us to walk away from this, did you, Richard? Collins asked quietly. Plans evolve, Margaret. The recording, Victoria said, nodding toward her phone. It captures everything you're saying right now. A problem easily solved. Monroe stepped forward to reach for the phone. It happened in an instant. Judge Collins lunged at Monroe, knocking his arm upward. The gun fired into the ceiling as they struggled. Victoria grabbed her phone and pulled Ellen toward the back door. They burst outside into the cool night air as another shot rang out inside the cabin. My car's down the road, Victoria said, pulling Ellen along. We need to… Wait, Ellen interrupted, pulling back. I need to get something. She ran to a shed beside the cabin, returning. Moments later with a small lockbox. Evidence, she explained breathlessly. James's real files, I kept copies. They ran through the woods toward Jenny's car, the sounds of pursuit not far behind them. As they reached the vehicle, Victoria spotted headlights approaching on the main road. It's Sheriff Carter, Ellen gasped. He was supposed to meet Monroe here. Victoria made a split-second decision, veering away from the car and pulling Ellen into the dense woods. We'll have to go through the forest, reach the highway on foot. As they stumbled through the darkness, Victoria played back the recording she'd captured. Monroe's confession was clear but incomplete. He'd admitted to corruption, to framing David, but not explicitly to murder. Ellen, Victoria said as they crouched behind a fallen tree, catching their breath. You need to tell me exactly what happened the night James died. Who really killed him? Ellen clutched the lockbox to her chest, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't supposed to be murder. It was just supposed to be evidence. Evidence of what? Of what he did to David in that room. The lessons. James recorded everything. Victoria felt sick. That's what's in the lockbox? Recordings? Ellen nodded. And something else, something James never knew existed. She opened the box and pulled out a small voice recorder. David was smarter than anyone knew. He started recording everything after his last hospital visit. She pressed play, and a child's frightened voice filled the night air. Dad says if I tell anyone about the room, he'll hurt Mom. But I need proof. Tonight he says it's time for the final lesson. He says I need to understand how the justice system really works. The recording continued, growing more disturbing by the second, and suddenly Victoria understood exactly what had happened the night James Rayner died, and why so many powerful people had conspired to hide the truth. Victoria and Ellen made it to a rural gas station by dawn. Using the payphone, Victoria called Frank at the Chronicle. Frank, I need you to send Jenny to pick us up. Highway 43, Miller's gas station. She kept her explanation brief, aware that phone lines might be monitored. While they waited, Victoria listened to the rest of David's recordings. The evidence was devastating, not just for Monroe and the others, but for the entire county's justice system. James Rayner had been using his own son to test defense strategies, subjecting him to psychological manipulation disguised as lessons. "How much did you know?" Victoria asked Ellen. "I knew he was hard on David, but not the extent," Ellen whispered. "James controlled everything, our money, our schedules, who we talked to. When I finally saw one of the recordings, I started planning our escape." Jenny arrived an hour later, her young face tense with excitement and fear. "The office is chaos," she reported. "Sheriff's deputies searched everything. Frank's stalling them, saying he needs to consult our lawyer before releasing your notes." "I need to confront Monroe," Victoria said, clutching the evidence. "Publicly, where he can't silence us." Jenny grinned. "I know just the place. Monroe's holding a press conference at noon today, announcing his run for state Attorney General." Victoria formulated a plan. She needed to make copies of everything, distribute them to multiple sources for protection, and she needed to reach the person who had been helping her all along. "Jenny, I need you to do something for me," Victoria said, writing a message on a slip of paper. "Send this text to this number." It's time my anonymous source showed their face. As Jenny drove them back toward Wilcox County, Victoria prepared for the most important confrontation of her career, one that would either bring justice or destroy her completely. The courthouse steps were crowded, with reporters and local dignitaries when they arrived. Monroe stood at a podium, Sheriff Carter and other officials flanking him. His campaign banners proclaimed, "Justice, integrity, experience." Victoria moved through the crowd, Ellen close behind, the recordings and evidence secure in her bag. She caught Monroe's eye just as he began to speak. His confident smile faltered for just a second. "Mr. Monroe," Victoria called out, loud enough for nearby reporters to turn. "Before you announce your candidacy, would you care to comment on your role in framing an 11-year-old boy for murder?" Chaos erupted on the courthouse steps. Camera crews swung toward Victoria as local reporters recognized the journalist who'd been making waves in their small community. "This woman is currently wanted for obstruction of justice and evidence tampering," Sheriff Carter announced, moving toward Victoria. "Actually," Victoria projected her voice, addressing the gathered media, "I'm here to present evidence of widespread corruption in Wilcox County's justice system, corruption that led to an innocent child being sentenced to life in prison." Monroe maintained his composure, his political instincts kicking in. "Ms. Lang is dealing with personal issues that have affected her professional judgment. Sheriff, please escort her from these premises." As deputies moved toward her, Victoria played her trump card. "I have recordings of District Attorney Monroe admitting to framing David Rayner. I have evidence that James Rayner's murder investigation was deliberately mishandled, and I have a witness." She gestured to Ellen, who stepped forward trembling but determined. "My son is innocent," Ellen stated, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed crowd. "These officials conspired to convict him to hide their own crimes." Monroe's face hardened. "These are serious defamatory accusations. I'll be filing lawsuits." "Richard," a new voice cut through the tension. Deputy Simmons pushed through the crowd, his young face resolute. "It's over." Victoria stared in shock, recognizing the voice, not disguised by electronics now, of her anonymous source. "Deputy Simmons has been providing me information," Victoria announced, "including evidence that was illegally withheld during David's trial." Simmons nodded. "I joined the department to uphold justice. What happened to that boy was wrong. I've already contacted the State Attorney General's office. They're sending investigators." Monroe's political mask finally cracked. "You're throwing away your career over a convicted murderer?" "No," Simmons replied firmly. "I'm doing my job, something you forgot how to do a long time ago." As state police arrived to secure the scene, Victoria realized their battle was just beginning. Exposing the truth was only the first step. Freeing David would require navigating a legal system designed to resist admitting its mistakes. But for the first time since this journey began, Victoria felt something she hadn't expected: hope. 3 weeks after the courthouse confrontation, Victoria sat in the sterile visitation room of Huntsville Juvenile Correctional Facility. The story had exploded across state and national media. Monroe, Collins, and Carter were under investigation. Evidence. Tampering and witness intimidation charges were pending. Yet David Rayner remained imprisoned. The boy who entered looked even smaller than Victoria remembered from the trial. His eyes were downcast, his movements tentative. He sat across from her without speaking. "Hello, David," Victoria said, gently. "I'm Victoria Lang." He nodded slightly. "The reporter. They told me you're trying to help me." "I am. Your mother is too. We have evidence proving you didn't kill your father." David's expression remained blank. "They won't believe it." "They already do, David. The state attorney general is reviewing your case. You could be released soon." Something flickered in the boy's eyes. Not hope, but fear. "And then what happens?" The question caught Victoria off guard. "You'll be free. You and your mother can start over." David stared at the table. "I don't know how to be normal. Dad said I never would be." Victoria fought to keep her composure. "Your father was wrong about many things. He said the world is built on lies, that justice is just a game powerful people play." David looked up, his eyes suddenly intense. "Was that a lie too?" Victoria chose her words carefully. "Systems can be corrupted, but that doesn't mean justice isn't real. What's happening now, people fighting to free you, that's real justice." David didn't respond. Instead, he pulled a folded paper from his pocket and slid it across the table. It was a drawing, crude but powerful. It showed his father standing in his office, but behind him were three shadowy figures, their hands on his shoulders like puppeteers. "What are you trying to tell me, David?" "Dad wasn't alone that night," he said quietly. "He was teaching me my final lesson about how the justice system works, how to make someone confess to something they didn't do." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Then they arrived. Dad seemed scared. They argued. I hid in the closet." Victoria leaned forward. "Who were they, David?" But the boy had retreated back into silence, his momentary openness gone. A guard announced visiting time was over as she gathered her notes. David spoke one last time. "The recordings didn't catch everything. Sometimes the most important parts happen when no one's listening." Victoria left with more questions than answers, the drawing clutched in her hand. The shadowy figures behind James Rayner seemed to watch her from the paper, guarding secrets still waiting to be uncovered, and she realized with chilling clarity that they had only scratched the surface of the truth. 6 months later, Victoria stood outside the juvenile court as David Rayner finally walked free. His conviction overturned, his name officially cleared. The evidence had been irrefutable once properly examined. The fabricated confession, the medical records showing David had been drugged, the testimony of Dr. Patel, and most damning of all, the recordings James Rayner had made of his own psychological abuse. But it was Deputy Simmons's testimony that had broken the case wide open. As Victoria's anonymous source, he had been gathering evidence of corruption for years, following in James Rayner's footsteps. He had witnessed Monroe, Collins, and Sheriff Carter conspiring to frame David after discovering James's body. What the public didn't know, what Victoria had kept out of her Pulitzer-nominated series of articles, was what David's drawing had led her to discover. The truth had come from an unexpected source. Trevor Phillips, James's former client who had initially been a suspect. Far from seeking revenge, Phillips had been working with James to expose corruption. He had been at the Rayner house that night, along with 2 other former clients, all victims of Monroe's fabricated evidence schemes. "We were there to collect final evidence," Phillips had told Victoria in a confidential interview. James was wearing a wire. The plan was to confront Monroe the next day with state investigators present. What no one had anticipated was Ellen Rayner returning home early, finding strange men in her house, seeing her husband's aggressive stance, and assuming the worst. In the chaos that followed, she had pushed James during their argument. He had fallen, striking his head on the corner of his desk. A tragic accident, not a premeditated murder. Phillips and the others had fled, leaving Ellen with her husband's body and a terrified child witness. When Monroe and Carter arrived, responding to an anonymous call likely from one of James's associates, they saw an opportunity to bury the corruption evidence forever. They convinced Ellen that she would be charged with murder unless David confessed instead. They drugged the boy, coached him through a false confession, and created the perfect scapegoat, a CEO, child who couldn't defend himself, with a mother too frightened to protect him. Now, as David emerged into the sunlight, Victoria saw not triumph, but the weight of undeserved trauma on his small shoulders. Some injuries couldn't be undone by headlines or legal victories. Ellen embraced her son, tears streaming down her face. She had received immunity for her testimony against Monroe and the others. Her accidental role in James's death would remain their secret, Victoria's final concession to a family that had already lost too much. As David passed Victoria, he paused briefly. "Was my father right?" he asked quietly. "About justice being a game." Victoria considered the question carefully. "Justice isn't the game, David. It's the reason we keep playing even when the game seems rigged. Because sometimes the truth does win." The boy nodded, his eyes older than his years. "But not. Everyone gets the same rules." He walked away with his mother toward their uncertain future, leaving Victoria with the knowledge that had defined her investigation from the beginning. The most perfect lie isn't the one that conceals the truth. It's the one that becomes more convenient than the truth itself. And in Wilcox County, convenience had convicted a child while the guilty had judged him from the bench, prosecuted him from behind a podium, and locked him away behind a badge. Some forms of justice would have to wait for another day.